We're going to kick things off with kind of a look at the state of the market here, and more importantly, taking the context of the numbers from 2020 and putting them into the context of 2021, because what's top of mind here is, yeah, COVID, been there, done that. Now I want to know, where do I grow? How do I grow? What's the path to it? And I think some illumination on how we evolved the last 18 months is going to put us in that perspective. So the total B2B volume of all US sales boils down to how B2B buyers and sellers coped and changed with the times in 2020. The last 12 months accelerated, with many e-commerce analysts considering a permanent shift in the way business buyers procure products and services for their organization. Going forward, more business buyers will do less buying by phone, fax, manual transactions, and more, frankly, online. Let's dive into what has changed, and more important, where digital B2B commerce and visual business transformation is heading from here. So it doesn't take a rocket science to point out the fact that if you look at the evolution or the timeline of B2B commerce, last year was a sea change of transformation. Now, e-commerce, as we all kind of know here, it'll change on a dime. But in this case, the trends that were established early on in the pandemic have now become mainstream acceleration. So in other words, there's no turning back. And now for a lot of companies of all sizes, what that meant was that first they were coping, then they were getting ahead, then they were coping, and then they're looking to kind of get ahead once again. So if you look at how the 4 quarters of 2020 broke down, it was, depending upon the market, very fragmented. If you're in the PPE space, the healthcare equipment space, that type of thing, it was feast. If you were in old line industrial industries, automotive, chemical, steel, just to kind of rattle those off, you know, your factories are idle, so your e-commerce sales dip. So if you look at the sum total of the big number here, total manufacturing sales, of course, lost steam last year. And you can see the numbers. They fell combined by basically almost 3% to roughly 17 trillion. So my takeaway here is that the one channel that did grow in the last year was, of course, B2B commerce. And so now let's kind of take a look at how it grew. But keep in mind, as I mentioned, the growth across the entire spectrum of B2B commerce, and that's a very wide nest to cast here, was very fragmented, very up and down, depends upon the market. And guess what? That trend is still here. Our next slides are going to kind of take a look at that. Okay, so if you're looking at the scorecard for just how much B2B e-commerce grew last year, then it grew less than the year before. But guess what? Of all the B2B channels, it grew by a pretty healthy 10%. And we spent a lot of time looking at that 10% because, as I mentioned, yet again, the growth across all channels was very fragmented, and it varied tremendously from market to market. And if you talk to the distributors and the manufacturers and the buyers and the sellers, like myself and my colleague Paul Demery do kind of day in, day out, what they will tell you is that to this day, they're still having a very hard time predicting what's lying ahead for 2021, because 2020, depending upon your market, was so yo-yo. In other words, forecasting where you go from here on an annual basis is still yet to kind of come into view. So as we kind of get into the back half of the year here, more of that will come. But if you look at Grainger, MSC, Systemax, I mean, some of the companies we have just coming up here in just a little bit, you know, they can tell you that their growth swung heavily from quarter to quarter, from pandemic type products to seeing a little less with mainstream industrial type products. So it's all coming back into focus. But last year, the growth was about 10% because COVID knocked down, shut down, partially took down multiple parts of the economy. And it takes time to kind of ramp that up. So a few more slides to kind of drive that home. Okay, growth areas. One of the fastest growth areas that really began coming online about 3 years ago, I mean, really began to kind of take some volume here, is e-procurement. And if you looked at the infographic that we just put out yesterday morning with our B2B e-commerce newsletter, Amazon Business just had a pretty mind-opening survey on this. And they surveyed 250 buyers, 250 sellers, and they documented from that survey why it was that e-commerce, or the online, the punch-up part of this, was one of the faster growing parts of the industry last year, growing by about a pretty good clip at 15%. So keep in mind that 15% was higher than the overall growth rate of 10%. So there's multiple reasons for that. And those kind of mirror themselves across a lot of the channels here. So our next slide will kind of give us a little hint about that. If you take out EDI, which we still count in digital commerce sales, I mean, EDI is still about upwards of 60% of all electronic transactions across manufacturing and distribution. It's not going away, more web enabled, but still for a lot of companies, it's a workhorse for mixing in with the entire mix here. So if you factor that out, then if you combine procurement with marketplace, with sites, with apps, you still grew by a pretty healthy 11.8% to just about 2.1 trillion sales. That's how big the size of the market is here. And if you look at the percent of all B2B sales, those channels I just mentioned are taking significant share. And that, I got to tell you, is one trend accelerated by the pandemic. And so where is all this headed? Where is all this coming into play? Well, if you look at what the pandemic did, here is a clear indication, at least in my view, of why the acceleration that began coming out of March in the lockdown, when we're all at home, we're all shifting channels to be much more digital because branches and call centers and physical sales and physical sales trips were canceled. This magnifies it to me. 12%, almost 13%, all B2B sales. 13% now of all B2B sales, with a T, with trillions, is now 13%. That'll go even higher this year. Electronic, you're coming up on a quarter growth here. And now let's kind of break down a few more stats here to kind of paint the frame for where we're going in 2021. Okay, so my takeaway here is that there is still a lot of manual transactions out there. But the takeaway here for anybody who's taking a look at our numbers today, it does not matter the size of the organization. It doesn't matter if you're as big as a Grainger or frankly as small as some of the smaller manufacturers and distributors that Paul and I talk to every single day. If you look at that first stat here, the takeaway is that is still the market for you. That's a $1 trillion market, a multi-trillion-dollar market. So the takeaway here is if you're just new to the game, you're still trying to figure out how to get in the game, there's going to be plenty of game for you to look at once you kind of get online here. So instead of looking at still, roughly this chunk of the market being offline and stuck in the old way, flip it around. Look at it this way. This is the market you want. Get there before other people, and you're going to have more sales in the competition. But yeah, the point is the market still has a long way to go. And this is where the opportunity lies. So our next slide will kind of take a look at that as well. Okay, so now just to kind of sum up here, where is 2021 taking us? So my crystal ball isn't set just yet. I mean, normally when we do the numbers for our annual report that kind of breaks down where B2B commerce went in the previous year, how it broke down by channels, how it fits in with total manufacturing, distribution sales. Normally, you start to kind of see that now through the second quarter because you got 6 months of data to kind of work on. Well, of course, we're still waiting to come out of the second quarter. And frankly, in previous years, I wouldn't take a hard look at any of the numbers until probably well into Q3. And the bellwether for that is taking a look at what a Grainger, MSC, Systemax, Watsco, companies that are public companies that kind of break out, these types of channels to kind of use that for just an informal gauge of where the market is heading. But I get a lot of people asking me, I get it. 2020 was an accelerated year. It was a fluke year. What are you looking at this year? So I'm going to take my first pass at you want a prediction. I think it's more of an observation than a prediction. But frankly, what I'm saying here is that still there are markets that are accelerating. there are markets that are still coming out of lockdown, still trying to come online here. So 15% is probably more a realistic view of how fast B2B e-commerce will grow in 2022. And by that, I want to be very specific. That does not include EDI. That does not include e-procurement. It does include sites, apps, marketplaces, and those types of online transactions. Frankly, e-procurement, I think, is going to grow faster than that 15%. I think the numbers will bear that out. But as the economy gains steam, that's how the market is going to grow. But keep in mind, I mean, the demand is there. The shift to more buyers, going less physical and more digital, of course, is there. But there's still curveballs. I mean, supply chains are going to be a huge issue. They're going to go well past these 12 months. So there could be lingering things that, even though our return to normal is appearing more in view, depending upon what city, what market you live in, and what vertical you do business in, still there's significant curveballs, and supply chain being one you'll have to contend with. Growth rates, they will vary as wide as the vertical is possible. So for instance, chemicals, the chemical industry is having a banner year for launching probably more marketplaces than any other vertical we're currently tracking. And if you talk with analysts as to why that is, the bigger players, among them DuPont and others, the big players got together and said, we're tired of the dark ages, the economics makes sense. And so you've seen the launch of no less than 9 vertical markets launched. And that is one indication of how one vertical is coming back to grow exponentially in 2021. But having said that, there are still supply chain problems. So domestic is one thing, international is something else. And keep in mind, it's a global village these days. So there's still a lot of the world yet to come online to kind of get back to an even keel. So that's why I reiterate that it will vary greatly from market to market, industry to industry. Aerospace, huge year 2019, not so good 2020, bouncing back a little bit in 2021. There's less planes in the fleet, less need for for parts and other things from from companies like Go Trade Direct at Boeing. That's their marketplace. But if there is a 900-pound gorilla that's out there and it's going to take significant more market share, it's going to be Amazon Business, and the analysts predict huge growth from that. Later on today, we're going to have Rob Green from Amazon Business give us a hint of what ahead. But keep in mind, 4 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago, my colleague Paul and I, we counted up maybe 70 vertical B2B e-commerce markets, for steel, oil, gas, food service, healthcare, that genre of vertical. I got to tell you, we're just about to go to press with our B2B marketplace 250. Originally, I said 100, but we have found more than 250. And frankly, if I went back and did the research once again, which we'll do for our upcoming quarterly reports here, it's going to be well over 300. So marketplaces aren't just a significant trend led by Amazon Business, led by Alibaba, led by others. They're becoming a significant sales driver of where the marketplace is coming into view. So summing up, where is it taking us? Well, the trends are going to continue. Keep in mind, this sea change is not just for a 12-month term or an 18-month term. This is permanent. I've been around e-commerce long enough where I kind of fancy myself, the industry historian, both on B2C and B2B. And I could see the sea changes that took place across B2C, the 2009 recession, those kinds of things. So you can see similar trend lines now developing in B2B, and that's driven by the fact that the change is permanent. So of course, there will be more business buyers doing less buying by phone, fax, manual. The acceleration is going to be permanent because COVID made sure of that. But here's the takeaway. Just as in any sea change, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And unfortunately, there are a lot of companies that are still shooting themselves in the foot with B2B commerce, and our panels and our speakers are going to kind of delve into some of the issues as to why that is. But the point is, There are companies that are farther along, more advanced, rethinking things because they had the base to do that. Others, not so much, still trying to figure it out in a market that a lot of people are still scratching their heads saying, I've never seen change come that fast. Well, guess what, my friends? That change will happen even faster.